Hello and welcome to this edition of World at War. I'm your host, Mohammed Saleh. The battlefields of Ukraine are soaked by the blood of innocents. For 5 months now, Russia has pounded Ukraine with a barrage of missile strikes and artillery gunfire. It is difficult to accurately ascertain the number of dead, but even conservative figures estimate that tens of thousands of lives have been snuffed out of existence in this brutal, mindless war that is being waged to determine the eastward boundaries of NATO's expansion. On the 14th of July, Russia fired a Caliber missile from the Black Sea, and it struck a business center and also the adjacent buildings in the central Ukrainian town of Vinnytsia. According to estimates, at least about 23 people have been killed and 90 others have been injured. President Volodymyr Zelensky has described this attack as an act of terror.
Today in the morning, Russian missiles hit the city of Vinnytsia, an ordinary, peaceful city. Cruise missiles hit 2 community facilities. Houses were destroyed. A medical center was destroyed. Cars and trams were on fire. This is an act of Russian terror. These are not people, they are not human beings who have done it. So 2 cruise missiles hit the city center. 20 people died as of now, including 3 children, and there's a huge number of wounded people.
One of the victims of this missile strike is this little girl Lisa. Her mother uploaded this video a while before the missile strike. The mother is also seen in this video, but she managed to survive the attack, but her leg has been torn off. On the same day, Russia claimed that it managed to shoot down Ukrainian jets in the eastern Ukrainian skies. It also destroyed the US-supplied weapons that had been trained on Russian positions. On the front lines in Donbas, the Ukrainian soldiers are putting the American-sent HIMARS weapon systems to good use. On the 13th of July, the Ukrainians managed to destroy a Russian ammunition depot in the Kherson region. A residential building in Mykolaiv was struck by the Russian shells on the 15th of July, but there are no reports of anyone being injured, as most people had already fled from the area. Harvesting in the middle of the war is a battle in itself. High-stake negotiations are presently underway in Istanbul to try and work out the modalities to ensure that the Ukrainians are able to export their agricultural produce from the Black Sea port of Odessa. But there are also allegations that Russia in some places has dropped incendiary ammunition on the fields of Ukraine. This video that has been put out by the Ukrainian government presents some evidence of how food grains have been turned into an instrument of war. The United States has supplied thousands of anti-aircraft missiles to Ukraine, and this is one of the reasons why the Ukrainian Air Force hasn't been overwhelmed in the battle for the Ukrainian skies. Ukraine is still deploying its fighter jets and even helicopters in carrying out defense operations against Russian positions. In this phase of warfare, one of the biggest challenges that confronts the Russians is to counter the US-supplied weapons to Ukraine. The Russian military recently put out this video claiming that it had destroyed the US-made Harpoon anti-ship missiles that had been smuggled into Ukraine to target Russian naval assets.
The armed forces of the Russian Federation continue the special military operation in Ukraine. High-precision Iskander land-based missiles near Berezan in Odessa region have destroyed launchers of the US-made Harpoon anti-ship missile system. In addition, high-precision weapons used by Russian aerospace forces have destroyed 12 areas of Ukrainian manpower and military equipment concentrations, 4 ammunition depots of the 79th Airborne Assault Brigade near Matveyevka-Nikolaev region and Ukrainian armored vehicle repair and recovery facility near Seversk.
In this terrible war of attrition, Russia is slowly grinding its way forward. It now has complete control of the Luhansk province, and it is now beginning to close in on the cities of Sloviansk and Kramatorsk. NASA's chief Bill Nelson sounded a dire warning this month. He accused China of wanting to take over the moon as a part of its military program. He was giving an interview to a German newspaper, and these are his words. "We must be very concerned that China is landing on the moon and saying that it's ours now and you stay out. China, of course, immediately hit back. It accused the NASA chief of engaging in an irresponsible smear campaign. So what really are the facts? For decades now, military strategists have said that space is the next frontier of confrontation. And in the last decade, China has made some remarkable progress. In 2019, China became the first country to land a spacecraft on the far side of the moon. In 2021, China launched its first core module of an indigenously developed space station called Tiangong, which means a palace in the sky. By 2026, China and Russia have joint plans to reach the south pole of the moon. And by 2027, China intends to build a permanent crewed lunar research station on the moon. Even with these achievements, controlling the moon is not going to be an easy task. The moon has a surface area that is said to be 5 times that of the Australian continent. And what NASA fears is that China might occupy or control certain strategic locations on the moon, like for instance some big craters with a large amount of lunar ice. To be clear, the Outer Space Treaty of 1967 specifically bars the appropriation or claims of sovereignty in deep space. It also bars states from placing nuclear weapons or other weapons of mass destruction in orbit or on celestial bodies, or stationing them in outer space in any manner. But there is a glaring loophole in this treaty. It only bans nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction. It does not ban weapons in general from being deployed in space. And this is precisely the reason why nation after nation in the last few years has announced the formation of a space command. Only 2 nations in the world, the United States and China, have an independent space command, while Russia's Space Force presently is a part of its Air Force. Just 11 countries around the world are part of the very elite club of nations that have the capacity to send a satellite into orbit using their own space launch vehicles. But here's the interesting part. A total of 16 nations so far have announced the formation of a space force. Even countries like Turkey, Brazil, or even Thailand for that matter, that can't even put a satellite into space with their own launch vehicles, have announced the formation of a space force. No one wants to be left behind in this scramble for space superiority. But the United States Space Command has the biggest budget at its disposal. For the forthcoming year, the United States Space Command has been allocated about $24.5 billion out of the budget for just its space defense purposes. China has not disclosed its space defense budget, but neither China nor Russia are splurging the kind of money that the United States is throwing into its space defense. Just last month, the United States formulated the National Space Intelligence Center, also called the Space Delta 18. Its core objective is to look for and identify critical intelligence on threat systems, foreign intentions, and also activities in the space domain. On the 13th of July, the United States launched its latest spy satellite, the NROL-162, into space with the help of a private company called Rocket Lab from its space launch site in New Zealand. Although no country has publicly acknowledged the number of military satellites that it has at its disposal, the United States is estimated to have over 154 military satellites orbiting planet Earth. Russia is a distant second with 71 military satellites, while China has about 63 military satellites in the orbit. France and Germany have about 9 and 7 military satellites in space. Now, space wars aren't a thing of the future. They're happening now and have already become a factor in the Russia-Ukraine war. Now, on the 10th of May, Russia was accused of jamming satellite internet in Ukraine, resulting in tens of thousands of modems going offline. And this was done through a cyber attack on a satellite, and the incident reportedly happened in late February, just after the Russian tanks rolled into Ukraine. But satellites aren't vulnerable to cyber attacks alone. At this moment, about 4 nations, that is the United States, Russia, China, and India, have demonstrated their capacity to strike and destroy satellites orbiting in deep space through what are known as anti-satellite weapons, with India being the latest entrant into this exclusive club. Cooperation between NASA and Roscosmos over the International Space Station ends in 2024. And with the relations being fraught due to the Ukraine war, will the agreements or the International Space Station be extended is anyone's guess. Humanity today stands on the edge of a new frontier. Space exploration can potentially turn humans into an interplanetary species. Celestial bodies hold the potential of almost unlimited resources. But the space race also threatens to spark space wars. There are decades when nothing happens, and then there are weeks where decades happen. These words of Vladimir Lenin aptly described what has happened in Sri Lanka this week. The Rajapaksa clan that for decades dominated Sri Lankan politics has now been scattered. Gotabaya Rajapaksa was forced to flee from the country. The convulsions that have shook Sri Lanka this week will determine Sri Lankan politics for years to come. But how did things precipitate so quickly? Our next report gets you the details.
The people of Sri Lanka rewrote their history books this week. Thousands upon thousands stormed the streets of Colombo with one clear demand. They wanted their strongman president, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, to go home. But as someone used to holding on to the reins of power for decades, Gota had no inclination to step down and go home. On the 9th of July, people's anger boiled over. Despite the heavy security presence, the protesters stormed the presidential palace. What followed was complete pandemonium. The protesters swarmed into the president's office. They dived into his swimming pool, cooked in his kitchen, and even took a nap in his four-poster bed. The hapless president took his suitcases and fled from the country. But this was just the beginning of high drama. The United States denied a visa to a president on the run. What is ironical is that Gotabaya was a dual citizen of the United States and Sri Lanka till 2019 and had given up his US citizenship only to become the president of the island nation. Rajapaksa landed in Maldives, but Mali made it clear that he was only there in transit. India has categorically denied facilitating his travel. And when Gotabaya Rajapaksa surfaced in Singapore, the city-state was quick to point out that Gota had not been granted asylum. In Gota's absence, people turned their anger against Ranil Wickremesinghe and stormed his office as well. Wickremesinghe ordered the military to do all it can to restore order in the country. But the Sri Lankan people have had enough of their political leaders. Braving tear gas and water cannons, angry at their economic collapse, and desperate due to food and fuel rationing, they wanted to take their destiny back into their hands.
Heavy inflow of tear gas that is being fired. The protesters are continuing to move away from the office of the Prime Minister, which is now the epicenter of tensions here in Sri Lanka. There is a steady round of tear gas that is being fired, but the protesters are still defiant to stay on and protest.
Gotabaya Rajapaksa sent in his resignation from Singapore. This for now has placated the anger of the Lankans. The search is on for a new political leadership in the country. But unless the political leadership can turn things around economically, the protests of the hungry stomachs will continue to rock the streets of Colombo.
Public protests are a rare sight in China. To stage a sit-in protest against any grievance which people may have invites an immediate and also a sharp reaction by the Chinese administration. But what can thousands of people do if their life savings get frozen for months on end? Well, they did what anyone would do when pushed to the corner. They took to the streets and demanded that the government must intervene. So how did the Chinese administration react? Our next report gets you the details.
This was the scene in front of the Chinese Central Bank in Zhengzhou. Over 1,000 people held up placards, shouted slogans and demanded that their money be returned back to them. Their placards read, "No deposit, no human rights." For a country that tolerates no dissent, this was a bold move. But it was hardly a few minutes that the protesters had gathered in front of the bank. That a warning was announced on the loudspeaker. Everyone was asked to clear out in 10 minutes. And soon enough, security personnel in plain clothes set upon the protesters. The protesters were dragged and pushed to the ground, even as they threw water bottles and tried their best to stand their ground. Four rural banks are said to be at the heart of this crisis. In the month of April, there was a bank run when a large number of depositors turned up to withdraw all their money. An estimated 39 billion yuan, or about $5.8 billion, was then frozen by the Chinese Central Bank. Initially, the rural banks told their customers that their accounts were frozen for some maintenance work. But government authorities allege criminal gangs have taken over the rural banks in a scandal that dates back to 2011. In June, protesters who were demanding their money be returned to them saw their health passes turn red. They suspected that officials were using the COVID tracking app to restrict their movement. The rural banks where the accounts have been frozen haven't issued any statement. But the government has been forced to act. Authorities in Henan have now made a commitment that funds frozen in the rural banks will be released. Payments will be made in batches, but the protesters are not convinced. This was a battle they say they should have never fought.
This week witnessed one of the most high-profile assassinations that we've seen in recent years. Shinzo Abe, the longest-serving Japanese Prime Minister, was gunned down in full public view. Everyone has seen the attacker, but what is not clear is the motive behind the killing. And a cult is also now being dragged into this killing of one of the most high-profile Prime Ministers of Japan. Take a look.
This was the moment when the former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe was shot at twice in the back. He was in the city of Nara to campaign for the elections for the upper house of the parliament in Japan. The police immediately tackled the attacker, identified as 41-year-old Tetsuya Yamagami. Who made no attempt to flee from the spot. He is said to be a former member of Japan's Maritime Self-Defense Force who had left active service in 2005. Shinzo Abe was transported by a medical helicopter to a hospital. But he soon succumbed to the bullet wounds. The cold-blooded assassination of the most popular Japanese Prime Minister in recent history shocked the world. There was an immediate outpouring of grief. What no one could understand was the motive behind killing Shinzo Abe. The man who had voluntarily stepped down from the Prime Minister's office due to his ill health. Japan has had its share of political assassinations. In 1960, the leader of Japan's Socialist Party, Inejiro Asanuma, was stabbed to death by a right-wing fanatic with a samurai sword. But the weapon which killed Shinzo Abe was a homemade gun that the attacker Tetsuya Yamagami had put together. The police raided his home and found several more such homemade guns and explosives. So was this a political murder? Or was Tetsuya Yamagami a fanatic who was seeking infamy by shooting a famous politician? The motive is not clear. As part of the investigation, the gunman reportedly killed Shinzo Abe because of a grudge he had against a religious cult. The attacker's mother had been part of the Unification Church, also known as the Moonies. She had suffered financial ruin after making large financial donations, which made Tetsuya Yamagami vengeful.
First, Tetsuya Yamagami is not a member of the Unification Church, and there is no record showing that he was ever a member of this church in the past. His mother is a member of our church and has been attending church events about once a month.
In clear contrast to the United States, Japan has some of the most stringent gun laws in the world. On an average, there are less than 10 gun-related fatalities across the country in a calendar year. In 2017, there were just 3 deaths linked to gun violence. Owning a gun in Japan is extremely hard. One must have no criminal record, must undergo mandatory training, psychological evaluation, and extensive background checks by the police. But the proliferation of cults in Japan is another matter. There are an estimated 2,000 cults currently active in the country. Most are vaguely linked to traditional Buddhist and Shinto faiths. Some are instituted just for tax evasion, while a few are very esoteric. The doomsday cult, known as the Aum Shinrikyo, was responsible for the deadliest terror attack in Japanese history. On the 20th of March in 1995, 13 people were killed and over 1,000 were injured when members of the cult released sarin gas in a Tokyo subway during rush hour. The Unification Church has its origins in South Korea. It has not been linked to any acts of violence. It is best known for its blessing or mass wedding ceremonies. But it has remained controversial for its active involvement in politics, its anti-communism stand, and its support for Korean unification. Shinzo Abe, his father, and also his grandfather reportedly had long-standing ties with the Unification Church. But in a twist of irony, a grudge against the cult appears to have culminated in Japan's most high-profile assassination.
When masses rise up in protest, political leaders get swept away in the tsunami of anger, like little chess pieces from a chessboard. And this is what happened with the Sri Lankan President Gotabaya Rajapaksa. And now there is a power vacuum. There's also wide speculation on who could be the next Sri Lankan president. This video clip has gone viral on social media. And these are common protesters who had stormed the presidential palace, and they're testing it out as to what it feels like to sit on the presidential chair. For these protesters, this is a photo opportunity of a lifetime. Gotabaya Rajapaksa, when he sat on this chair, must have felt invincible. But the very people who kept voting for him again and again have now forced him to flee in the thick of the night. I'm your host, Mohammed Saleh. Thanks for watching. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.